Good morning. It's October. It's October. It's first Sunday in October. This is my Sunday school. Uh, we are in the book of Genesis. Just for those of you who are happening across this accidentally, be warned, this is Sunday school. We've been studying Abraham, and we're just reading through the Bible. We were finishing chapter 11, and now we are in chapter 12. Um, so I would like to remind those who've been keeping up where we are and what's happening. Um, God has called Abraham. He was in the Ur of the Chaldees, which is in the southern part of, I guess, what today would be Iraq. Um, at that time, it was Sumer, called Sumer, and the Chaldeans had come in and taken over that area. And so he lived in a place called Ur. And um, his father had three kids, right? Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. Abraham's the youngest. He had Haran when he was 70. He didn't have Abraham till he was 130, so 60 years later. So there's like a 60 years difference between Abraham and his older brother. I know what that's like. So Abraham's the baby, and Abraham's oldest brother, Haran, he had three kids. One was Lot. We know about Lot, Abraham's nephew. Milcah, his daughter, and Iscah, another daughter. And Abraham's brother married Milcah. They had 8 kids, which was kind of the norm in that time, just to have a bunch of kids. Uh, Abraham married Sarai, I guess you might say. And Sarai was his stepsister. So Abraham's mother had passed. His father, Terah, married another woman, had Sarai, and Abraham married her. The brother, Nahor, he left and went somewhere. And so now it's just kind of in the house. Iscah, the sister, his Abraham's niece, went somewhere. Um, and so it's just Abraham and Lot, his nephew, in the house with the dad, Terah. So they moved up north to what we would call Syria. Well, yes, that's what it is, modern day Syria area. So they went up north, and that happened when Abraham was about 7 years old. After 5 years in a place called Haran in what is today modern day Syria, Abraham's father dies. So he dies when he's 75 years old. And Abraham still has his nephew Lot and his wife Sarai. She's barren. She hasn't had any kids.
He's still Abram. No.
He's Abram, right? Thank you. So at this point, they're calling him Abram. And so while he's there, after his father has died, God speaks to him. So in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, we're just going to back up 4 verses. We did the first four verses last week. We're going to go beyond that. I just want to back up and review. So now the Lord speaks to Abraham. So what is special about Abraham that all the people on the earth, God hasn't spoken to one personally since Noah that we know of. That's been recorded in the scripture. And Noah is Abraham's great grandfather. But God suddenly starts speaking again after, I don't want to say he's stepping back, but after not being that actively involved in people's personal lives where he's appearing to people that we know of. He chooses Abraham. It's like, what qualities did Abraham have? Was he this God-fearing person? Doesn't seem to be what the quality was. In Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, which we haven't gotten to yet, the messengers of God are kind of discussing this particular quality that I believe is why God picked Abraham. In Genesis 18:19, it says, "For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring Abraham at this time what he has spoken to him." So God's making this promise. He's about to make a promise to Abraham, and he says, I know that Abraham is somebody who will command his children, that they keep God's laws and that they do righteousness. And that was a quality that most people apparently didn't have. Because, God had just judged the world with Noah, and 2 generations later, Nimrod, they could care less that God had just judged the entire world. um, Same thing like with Cain. People have the shortest memories. God would do, and I guess we're like that. God would do these incredible things, and we must be like that, right? Because God will deliver us. God will bless us. We're down to how are we going to pay the rent this month? And then God blesses you, and He comes through. And then 3 months later, how are we going to pay the? We're back in a panic again because we think God is forgetful, or God only has one trick up his sleeve, or something we think. So I want to act like they're really crazy, but we're all the same. We're the same. That's why we can read the Bible and see ourselves in it. We're just like them. So for some reason, God would do these phenomenal things, and then the next generation would just forget about it, whether it was blessing or cursing, whichever way, are consequences. So he says, I know Abraham is someone who will command his children and his household after him that they keep the way of the Lord. So I think that was the quality. He was somebody in his personality. He was forceful, and he was going to make sure that his children kept the way of the Lord and they kept the commandments, and it got passed on. Because what's the point of God appearing to somebody and giving them the whole plan of life if they're going to forget about it 2 hours later? And sometimes we want God explain everything to me, tell me everything. But if He does, we're gonna forget about it. So some of us have that personality, and a week later we'll still be, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't understand. And so it's like, God just says, let me just give you this part that you can understand for today. That's kind of how He treats us. I'm gonna give you what you can get for today. And I guess it would be silly for us to try to teach first graders calculus. Let me just start you off with what you can handle, and then as you mature, I'll give you more. We may want more, but we're not ready to handle it. We're not going to. But Abraham was somebody, he was going to command his children, so that's why God picks him while he's in uh, Iraq, the Ur of the Chaldees. Um, he decided at that point, but he didn't say anything until he'd gone up to Syria, to Haran, and his father had died. And now Abraham was ready for the next chapter of his life. And sometimes God will do that because He knows you're ready to move on and you can handle what's next. I'm going to bust some myths, though, about Abraham, because Abraham had to learn faith. What we're going to see what happens to him next is God teaching Abraham faith. He had to learn it. And so God took him through several things in order to teach him faith. And we look at that and go, maybe that's what God's doing to me. Maybe that's why certain things are happening in my life in a certain way, because God is teaching me faith. So He appears to Abraham while he's up in Syria, in Haran, and says, get out of your country, away from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. So it was important that he separate himself from his family, get away from all of them. We discovered that his family were idol worshipers, just like everybody else. It's not like they were unique or evil or anything. In that whole region, especially since Nimrod in those days, everybody worshipped different idols. There was a god of the river, and a god of the mountains, and a god of this, and a god of that, and they just created all these gods. And his family had gods and carried them with them, and they really were there. And he says, you got to separate yourself, and sometimes we have to separate ourselves, because it's all about choices. And God can tell us to do something, but He's never going to make us do something. And so sometimes, for you to make this choice, you're going to have to separate yourself from those things that are influencing us wrongly. So get away from that situation, and God will create a situation sometimes in order to separate us. Oh no, why do we have to move to the other side of the country, or why am I being forced to change up? And sometimes that's the best thing for us. God knows that there's something there that's bad for us that He is helping us separate from. So Abraham, get away from your family. They're all idol worshipers, and go to a country that I'm going to show you once you get there. Now that did take faith. That took faith, but God appeared to him. So if God appeared to me right now and said, I want you to start walking, I probably would. If He comes that big. There's various ways that God speaks to us. The primary way he speaks to us is just that still small voice. Something said, oh, we always say this, something told me I should have brought an umbrella. Or, oh man, something told me to call you earlier. Something told me that's God in us. It's coming from nowhere. Like we're not thinking about that thing and suddenly a person will pop in our heads or a situation and we go, oh, that's the primary way he speaks to all of us. So God speaks to all of us. But were he to appear, that means greater. There's a bunch of consequences coming. There's bigger challenges coming, and you need to know that you know that you know that you know that God is asking you to do something. So it wasn't that phenomenal that Abraham would start walking, because one of the gods that he had heard about has appeared to him and said, I want you to start walking. What was good about him, though, he was obedient, because we don't have to. God appeared to a whole bunch of people and said a whole bunch of stuff, and they didn't listen. So good for Abraham that he was obedient. But God is still teaching him faith. And he says, here's what will happen. And there are promises of God that are conditional, and there are promises of God that are unconditional. There are promises of God says, if you do this, then this will happen. There are other promises where God says, here's what I'm going to do. This happened with Abraham later. The messengers of God said, let us go down and tell Abram, or Abraham at that time, what I'm about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. There was no condition on it. Let him tell me what I'm about to do. Abraham thought he could put a condition on it because that's how his previous relation had been with God. If you do this, if you do that, then I will do this. But this was not a conditional promise. I'm going to do something. And there's certain things that God is going to do in our lives, and it doesn't make any difference what we do, what we think about it. If we try to stop it, he's saying, here's what's going to happen. Other promises, so there's certain promises in the Bible that we can just bank on, period. This is what God's going to do, doesn't matter what. Other things are conditional. If you do this, then here's what will happen. So he says, if you go to this land, now if Abraham had stayed, none of this would have happened. But he says, if you get and go to this land that I will show you, then I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Now, here's the third type of promise of God. There are promises that are conditional, where we have to do something, and he says, and then I will do the rest. There are promises that are not conditional, and then there are promises that are only for certain people, and I know we don't want to hear that. But what God has promised to certain people, he's promised to them, and he's not promising everybody. And this is like shocking, and so people are already clicking me off, and I apologize in advance for all you people. But certain promises God makes to certain people, and I can't have that promise he made to that person. But I can have all the promises that God made in the Bible that just apply to all people who are righteous. If you're righteous, here's what's going to happen. If you believe in God, here's what's going to, and that's period. Those promises we can just sit out and expect and enjoy. But certain promises in the Bible, God made to certain people, and they only belong to them. So the first half of the promises really were only to Abraham. The second half were to all of us. So I will make you a great nation. We can't all claim that. We can't all say, yes, and God, I thank you. You're going to make me a great nation, and I'm going to. No, he told that to Abraham. That's not a promise to me. I will make your name great. Yes, God, you're going to make my name great, and people will remember me for thousands of years. No, you can't claim that promise. It was made to Abraham. And you will be a blessing. All that was made to him. Here's one thing, though, that he said that I can apply to myself. I will bless those who bless you. So, and meaning those who believe in what Abraham is doing, those who say, okay, yes, that man's following God, and I'm going to pray for that sort of faith, and those who bless you, Abraham, those who help you, those who believe in what you're doing, those who support you, those who take what's happening with you as their own gospel, they will be blessed. Conversely, I will curse those who curse you. Those who say, Abraham doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to try to prevent Abraham from doing what he's doing. None of that makes any sense. None of that's true. That's a promise that falls on all of us. So if we curse what God was saying to Abraham, we'll be cursed. If we bless what God was saying to Abraham, we'll be blessed. So we can have part of that. And it says, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that's me. That's you. Because of what God promised to Abraham, there is a blessing that we will all get. Now, we'll discuss later what that blessing is. But because of what Abraham is doing, God's saying, I'll be able to bless all the families of the earth. I wish it meant every single member of every single family, but each family on this earth has been affected by what happened to Abraham. And so all the families, there's not a family on the earth who's not touched by what happened to Abraham. Some member of every family on this earth has been blessed in some way by what God is doing with Abraham. Okay, so I'm just going to go on from there. So in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, 5 through 8, this illustration came to me. I'm sorry that I just want to. So your parents giving you a birthday party, and they say to you, "Here's what I am going to do. I am going to give you a birthday party." Now, so that's a promise that has nothing to do with whether the child likes it or not, or it's like God saying, "Here's what I'm going to do." But here's the conditional part. If you act right, then I've got this wonderful present for you. So if at your party you act right, then I'm going to give you that pony that you wanted for your birthday. That pony, isn't that funny? I'm still from the 50s and give examples from the 50s because kids don't want ponies today. But back in, when our parents were kids and we kept hearing these stories, it was always about a pony. So, but I'm going to give you that, whatever it is, that car that you wanted, but it's conditional. You have to act right.
Give you that Ford Pinto.
Right. So, see, at the party's going to happen no matter what. But that particular present, that Ford Pinto, I am going to give that to you if you act right. And I also have gifts for everybody who comes to your party. Everybody else, they're going to get some cake and they're going to get some this and that. Now, they're not all getting the Ford Pinto.
There you go.
God didn't make that promise to everybody. So everybody at the party, when you open your gift, they can't all, well, where's my Ford Pinto? The parents didn't make that promise to everybody. But I do have all this other stuff for you. You're going to play games, and you will be blessed if you come to this party. Again, that's conditional. Those who didn't show up at the party didn't get the gift. And so that's conditional. So there's certain things that God's going to do no matter what, certain things that are conditional, and there's certain things that are promised to specific people, certain promises in the Bible that I cannot claim because they were not made to me. Now, so Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. So he's got Lot, his nephew, he's got Sarai, his wife, and that's it. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he was 5 years in Haran. Then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So Abram's father was quite successful. Rabbinic commentaries. So there's what was written in the Bible, and then there's what there was lore that was passed on by oral tradition that has been written down. That's not in the Bible, but that lore says that Abraham's father was an idol maker, and he was quite successful because they loved worshiping them some gods. So that's like if you were a phone maker today, you'd be quite rich because we love worshiping about some phones. And so everybody had to have God. And the more gods you had, the more successful you thought you would be. So rabbinic tradition tells us that he made out. So he's quite successful. So when his father passed, Abraham's the only one with him, and Lot. So they took all that stuff with them and the people, all of his servants. Here's a hint of how many people. In Genesis chapter 14, when Lot's brother got kidnapped, long story, we'll get there. So Genesis 14:14 says, now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, and that means his nephew. Again, the word brother can also mean nephew. Okay, was taken captive. He armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So there was 318 people that had been born in his own household. Again, starting back with his father, that he took with him. So Abraham's taking a bunch of people with him. And those are the people that Abraham took when he went to get Lot and bring him back after he'd been kidnapped. So they have a bunch of people. Okay, so Genesis chapter 12. So he takes all his possessions, all of his people, and they're traveling, and they're just telling everybody, and they're going, where are we going? And everyone's like, I don't know. Well, okay, but God appeared to me, so I'm going to start walking. So he's traveling now, and he enters what is modern day Israel, what they called at the time Canaan, and he enters in the north, and he goes down to the middle of Canaan, and he stops. So they came to the land of Canaan, and Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem. Now, Shechem means like shoulder or bridge, like shoulder between two mountains. Mount Ebal is on one side, Mount Gerizim is on the other. These two mountains and Shechem play a large role in Israel's history. And we'll hear about Ebal and Gerizim kind of stand for blessing and cursing. And Shechem is the shoulder between. That's what Shechem means, shoulder. And so he went and he went as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. So there's a valley of Moreh, and there's this big terebinth tree. And apparently they all knew about it. Moses is writing this again to people who know these stories and know these places and have seen it a bunch of times. And it'd be like me, writing story. And we went all the way down and we stopped at that, that big May Company building, that iconic May. Everybody knows May Company on the way to Westwood, on La Brea. Now, it's not there anymore. The terebinth tree is not there anymore. But at the time of the writing, everybody knows about it. So you might use that as a landmark, right? So he's talking about the terebinth tree and Shechem, and that's where he stops. Now, it's very important. I believe that he stopped there because God speaks to him and says, here, this is the land I'm going to give you. So this is the first time God has spoken again since he said, just start walking. And Abraham's looking around like, you're going to be in this land? Yeah, but he's looking around like, there's all these Canaanites. But finally, because he hadn't heard a thing from God, he just keeps walking and walking and walking. And I really got an illustration of this when I was driving to my friend's house. I'd never been there before, my friend Jessica. And she lives way out somewhere. And I programmed it into my GPS, and the GPS talks to me and said, start driving, so I'm on the 405, and it didn't say anything else. And I'm waiting for it to, because I'm just driving, like how many miles? And it's not telling me anything. And I started to get nervous. I pulled off the side of the road, like it hasn't said anything. And really the exit was like coming up. It was in a mile, but I got panicked because I hadn't heard anything. And I thought the GPS is broken and I passed it and I'm going to end up in Mexico. And I was just like nervous, right? Because I'm on the standing on freeway. And so I can imagine how Abraham felt because God hadn't said anything. He just said, start walking. So finally, when he gets to Shechem, God says, here. So now Abraham knows that he can trust God because he's spoken a second time. Now, like I knew my GPS wasn't broken because it spoke a second time when it said, and you got 1 more mile to go to that next exit. Okay, it's not broken. So I'm telling you, because this is Abram's first meeting with God. And so God purposely didn't say anything because faith is not me telling you something every 2 minutes. That's not faith. We want God to talk to us every 2 minutes. That's not faith. That's a crutch. Faith is evidence of things not seen. So faith is mean I believe and I don't see where I'm going, but I'm believing. So God's not going to keep talking to us and keep talking to us. He's going to tell us something once, and then at a certain point he'll say, "Okay, now that you've gone this far, I'll give you the next step." So he got to Shechem. So I believe at that point Abraham finally got rid of his idols. I believe that's where he buried his idols because until then he didn't know if he had made that up or not. Here's some reasons why I believe this, because this became a place where people started to bury their idols, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Abraham's grandson, Jacob. So he's got his 12 kids with him. Joseph's the youngest, he's 13 years old, but his other kids are a lot older. And this is after 2 of his oldest sons had attacked the men who had raped his sister. And Jacob was mad at them, like, I know that you're upset that they raped your sister, but these people in this country, they're all going to kill us now, and we're all going to die. So that may not have been the best way to handle it. And so, but then they said, well, but what are we supposed to do?
that.
Well, not that wasn't what you're supposed to do, because you killed all these people, and now we got to get out of here. So it says in Genesis chapter 35, verse 2 through 4, and Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves and change your garments. So even Jacob, just Abraham's grandkid, even well, remember he had married Rebecca, and the other one, the first wife, Leah, and then they all were Laban's kids, right? His cousin's kids, and they all still worshipped idols. And so he had gone from Laban, and they still just carried idols with them, because everybody carried idols. So even though Jacob didn't carry idols, they all did. They all had them, his wives and their servants, etc. So he says, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourself, change your garments, then let us arise and go to Bethel. Now when Abram first got to Canaan, he stopped in Shechem, and then Bethel was his next stop. And we can see his growth from Shechem to Bethel, right, which is his house of God. So we're going to go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So I'm going to, because when Esau was about to kill me, God appeared to me in Bethel, and I prayed to God, and we're going to go back to that place. And sometimes we need to go back to that place where God spoke to us, and so I'm going to go back there. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their earrings. I'm saying earnings, bless my heart. And the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. So he buried them there. And I think, to me, that was the place that they tended to bury stuff on foreign gods. And I think that's where Abraham finally said, okay, maybe I can let go of these gods. Here's another example. In Joshua, when the people had started, so they were in Egypt for 400 years, and then Joshua leads them back to the promised land, to Canaan land. So they're back finally after being gone 400 years. But they're all starting to worship other gods, which they love to do, which we love to do. And Joshua said to the people, here's an example of people taking scripture out of context. In Joshua 24, verse 19, it says, but Joshua said to the people, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. Now, in the context, if you've read above, the people had started serving other gods. And Jacob saying, you can't serve God and these other gods. That's what he'd been talking to them about. Put away those other gods, because you can't serve the Lord and those other gods. Jesus said that you can't worship God and money. But you could have just taken the first part. Jesus said you cannot worship God and the money. So you can't worship two things. And God is a jealous God. And that's just the truth. We're either going to trust God, or we're going to trust money. We're going to trust our car, or we're going to trust God, or we're going to trust what Oprah said, or not that I'm against Oprah. We're going to trust God, or we're going to trust who's going to be our source? But God is telling us you can't have two sources. So you got to pick. And so that's what Jacob is saying, Joshua was saying to them. You can't serve God and these other gods. So if you forsake the Lord, and he warns them in verse 20, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after he's done you good. So if you, after all that he's done for you, brought you out of Egypt and saved you from all these plagues, and then you're going to come and start serving foreign God, God's going to do you harm. So maybe you should just keep serving those gods. But if you pretend like you're serving God and then you go back to serving these idols, that's going to be a problem. So Joshua said to the people in verse 21, and the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Because he's using psychology on them. He's saying, you can't serve God. No, we'll serve the Lord. We'll serve the Lord. So in verse 22, Joshua said to the people, again, we're in Joshua 24, verse 22. So Joshua said to the people, okay, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord for yourselves to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. Yes, we are promising. Okay. Now, therefore, he said, put away the foreign gods which are among you and incline your heart to the Lord God of Israel. The people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. So they went to Shechem and they buried their gods. And then Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, verse 26. And he took a stone and set it up there under the oak. That's the terebinth tree, which is by the sanctuary of the Lord. So that's the place where if you're going to get rid of your gods, you go to Shechem and you bury your gods. So I believe, but it doesn't say this, that when Abraham got to Shechem, that was the first phase of, because God finally spoke to him again. Now he's in the middle of Canaan. He's on the shoulder between blessing and cursing in Shechem. And God saying, okay, I want you, bury your gods here. And now you know that I'm real. Okay. So I just want to read you one more thing. It's really just interesting. What's his name? Gideon. This is during the book of Judges. After they'd been there in the Canaan land for a long time, God hadn't spoken to anyone for a long time, and when God doesn't speak for a long time, we get itchy and nervous. And although God hasn't changed, nothing has changed. I don't know why we get nervous. And God wants us to just trust Him. If I've said it, I'm going to do it. I don't want to keep saying it every day because then you don't have faith in me. You just have faith in the fact that I'm going to, like an alarm clock every day, say, yeah, no, I'm still here. I'm still here. That'd be like your parents waking you up once an hour. Hi, I'm still here. I'm still here. Like at a certain point, the kid has to just trust that the parents are still in that room. When you have a newborn baby, you want to check on it every 30 seconds. I get it. But at a certain point, you have to have faith, and your child has to learn, my parents are still here. I don't have to cry out to them every 30 minutes. Mommy, Daddy are still here. Yes, I'm still here. And you need to teach them that if I've said it, if I said I'm still here, if I said there's no monsters in your closet, if I've said to you, you need to learn to trust my words. And God teaches us that same thing. I'm not going to say it every half an hour because that's not good, that I come in every 30 minutes and say, see, there's no ghost. See, there's no boogeyman. Because you're not learning to trust my words. So if I say it once, I'm not going to say it again. That's so we learn to trust the words. So that later, if I say, look both ways before you cross the street, you have learned to trust my words. You won't think, I don't want to have to say it 15 times to you. That's not faith. That's not trust. So there's a reason sometimes God will only say something once and it'll be a long time before he says it again. All right. So during the book of Judges, God hadn't spoken to anyone and appeared to anyone for a while, and they'd gone crazy because that's what they do. And so God finally appears to Gideon. His name was Jerubbaal, but another version of his name is Gideon. And he had led them against the Midianites, and they'd won a battle. Now, Gideon had a bunch of wives, because when God doesn't speak for a long time, people just act kooky. And so Gideon had a bunch of wives, and he had 70 children. So, and the youngest of them was Jotham. He was the youngest of 70, and those were his wives. Now he had a secret concubine, and had a child with his concubine, and his name was Abimelech. So Abimelech knows that once Gideon passes away, and he does, that he's going to get cut out of the will, because I'm not even a son of one of the wives.
Side piece.
I'm just a side piece. Thank you for that word from God, from my wife. So he's nervous. He's going to get totally cut out. So Abimelech leads an insurrection against the other 70 brothers. And in Judges chapter 9, verse 5, it says, then he went to his father's house at Ophrah. Ophrah. It's almost Oprah, but it's not. And killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, which is Gideon, with one stone. Like, he went to their house. They were having this big party. He went to their house and just one by one killed them all with one stone, because they were not expecting to be killed by their brother, who's not even really, he's like a stepbrother or half brother or whatever. And but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left because he hid himself. So he was smart. He was like his daddy, hiding. Because remember when Angel first came up to Gideon, he was hiding in the wine press. Oh, I'm just throwing up trying to get a breeze here in this wine press. And the good news is God doesn't care. You can be a scaredy cat. God will still use you. It's okay. So Jotham, who was like his daddy more than anybody knew, hid. And so all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Millo, and they went and they made Abimelech the king beside the terebinth tree that was in Shechem. They took it like, yay, this is our guy. And they took him stupidly to the terebinth tree, which is where you go to bury the false gods. Bethel, which is where Abraham went next, that's where you go for dedication to God. But Shechem is the place of false gods and choices between Gerizim and Ebo, between blessing and cursing. That's when you, okay, I'm going to let go of my gods here in Terebinth. But they're so stupid. They took Abimelech and they took him there to Shechem. Okay, now it says, now when they told Jotham what had happened, they'd made him king. He went and he stood on top of Mount Gerizim and he lifted his voice and he curses them and he says, here's what's going to, and he calls out the curses on them. Here's what's going to happen to you because you've done all this, you've done all that, and you've been bad, and you stupid and went to Shechem, to the terebinth tree, where everybody's been bearing their false gods there. Why would you go to a place of false gods? Anyway, confused on the concept. So he went and pronounced the cursings, and it all came to pass because God's not stupid. Okay. Anyway, so he's there. He stops in Shechem. I believe, but it's not in the Bible, it's just I believe that Abraham started the tradition of finally getting rid of his father made idol and said, okay, God spoke to me again, so now I can trust that I'm not crazy. And in Genesis chapter 12, we're back to the lesson. In verse 6, it says, and the Canaanites were then in the land. At that point, Moses is writing down, it's full of Canaanites, but God's still saying, this is what I'm going to give you. And in verse 7, it says, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So in Shechem, that's what he first said, something like in the middle of Canaan. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So he said, okay, now I can worship you. My heart can rest because I've heard you speak a second time. So he's building faith. He's teaching Abram faith. And he moved from there and he went further south to the mountains east of Bethel. So now he goes to Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel. Bethel was on the west, and Ai was on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So here's the first time he's actually calling on the name of the Lord at Bethel. So Bethel became the place of the house of God, where that's where Abraham first called on the name of the Lord. Okay, so Abram journeyed, and then he left there, Bethel, and he went even further south. And again, calling on the name of the Lord is significant when Moses writes it in Genesis, because if you remember that Cain had a bunch of kids, right? Cain kills his brother, then Cain goes and builds his own city, and he has a bunch of kids, and they were like his grandkids and great grandkids. They were defying God, and then it says, but Seth had a bunch of kids. That's the son that replaced Abel. He had a bunch of kids, and it says, and men began to call on the name of the Lord. So when Moses says that, he's saying, here's when people finally begin to dedicate themselves to the Lord. So in Bethel, that's where Abraham first dedicated to the Lord. And Beth means house, and El Shaddai, El means God. So house of God. Okay, so now he's going further south to Egypt. Why? Because in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, now there was a famine in the land. God is using this famine to move Abraham to Egypt. God is the God of circumstance. God is the God of the elements. The devil can't bring it. The devil doesn't bring storms. The devil doesn't do that. God says, I'm the God in the storm and the whirlwind. That's me. When you see these things, know that it's me. So this famine happens, and Abraham doesn't know any of these Canaanites, but he knows he can go down to Egypt because there's always plenty of food in Egypt. So he goes to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And in verse 11 of Genesis chapter 12, it says, and it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. So here's what Abraham did not know. And again, we have this image that Abraham is just so faithful and so, but not at first. God has to teach him faith. There are no believers. Abraham's the father of the believers. There weren't any believers. So Abraham didn't know that God would protect him in Egypt. We've got to learn that God will protect you in Egypt too, because when he went to Canaan, God said, I'm going to give you this land. So Abraham's looking, in Abraham's mind, God is the God of Canaan. He didn't know that God would protect him in Egypt. I hope that makes sense. He didn't know that. And again, we have experiences sometimes in church. We'll see miracles happen in church. People prayed for in church. So we don't know that God will do a miracle in CVS pharmacy. We don't know God will do a miracle at the bank or in our lawyer's office or, on Manchester when the police stop you. We don't know that God can do a miracle there. So that's why we act crazy sometimes and we get upset and we do certain things because we know that we don't act crazy in church. People don't go nuts in church because they know God's there. And that's where we tend to confine him. But God is God everywhere. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to know that. God doesn't just swoop in and do stuff. He wants us to call on the name of the Lord there also. So Abraham gets to Egypt. He has no idea that God is also God in Egypt. He knows he's God in Canaan. And so he's rightly in his mind saying, they're going to look at my wife, see how beautiful she is. They're going to kill me and they're going to let her live. So I need to come up with some sort of plan. And interestingly enough, that's why Romans 8:31 says, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Not tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, sword. Nothing can separate. If God is sending us somewhere, the devil can't harm us. So we have to know that God, if he's sending you, now if he hasn't sent you, stuff may happen. But if God is sending you, he's got you. We don't have to worry wherever we are. So Abraham comes up with his own plan because he thinks God, they're going to kill me there. Even though God has promised all this stuff, I'm going to make you a great nation, that's only going to happen in Canaan. It's not going to happen in Egypt. So he says, please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, that I may live because of you. Now, here's a second thing that he didn't know. He didn't know that God was going to fulfill his promise through Sarai. Sarai was barren. God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to make you a great nation. But he's looked at her. She's 10 years younger than him. She's 65 now. She hasn't had any kids. His brother has had 8 kids by now. So he's thinking, okay, you can make me a great nation, but but not through her, through somebody else. So here, they can have you, but I must live so that God might fulfill his promise. So we sometimes don't know how God is going to fulfill his promise. So we will cut off certain avenues because we think, well, God's not going to do it that way. Well, he might. Why are you don't know how God is going to do it. But sometimes we decide how God is going to do something. I know how God's going to do this. He's going to do this, and then I'm going to do a phone call, and that's going to happen. And when it doesn't work that way, we're confused. We end up with an Ishmael in our life. And that wasn't the way God said he was going to do it. The God says he's going to do it, he's still going to do it. But we end up wasting time down a path that God didn't call us to. So he has no idea God's going to fulfill through Sarah. So for as far as he's concerned, I need to go down there, get some food. I'm going to go back up to Canaan. And if they take you, oh, well. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 14. So it was when Abraham came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman and that she was very beautiful. And the princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. Said, oh, you need to check her out, check her out. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And he treated Abraham well for her sake. Like, oh, let me take your sister. Because that was the story they'd come up with. And treated him well, and gave him stuff. It says, and he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. And again, Abraham didn't have to go through any of that. But he had decided God was going to do it through a different way so I can sacrifice Sarah. Right? And the Pharaoh treated him well. Let me take your sister and here I'll bless you. So who knows? But anyway, okay. So here's the good news. You can't stop God's plans. So even though he had given Sarah away, he literally said, here, take her. And the Pharaoh was about to marry Sarah. God was planning on using Sarah. And so we can't stop the way God, even if you mess up, even if you go ahead and give Sarah away, if God's planning on using Sarah, he'll get her back. So in verse 17, it says, but the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Because at certain points, Sarah couldn't keep it to herself. well, he's like, why is all this happening? Because I'm Abraham's wife. What? Why didn't you tell me this was your wife?
Nobody tell me
Nothing. Oh my god. Okay, anyway, so verse 19, why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife, like I was about to. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. Now, here's the deal. At that point, he could have killed Abraham and taken her because Abraham's by himself with his 318 guys, but still basically by himself in Egypt. If that's who this one was, Pharaoh had told himself a story about Pharaoh and what was going to happen, and that's not really what turned out would happen. He said, "Here, take her." Well, and God assured of that, right? Because again, God would have done if he had sought to take her. God would have immediately plagued Pharaoh, and he was, "Oh, I better stop trying to take her." So God would have protected her. So we don't have to come up with a lie. We don't have to come up with our own way of doing things because we think, well, let me help God out. We don't have to help him out. So, and it says, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Here, and they plus he had extra camels and sheep, everything that he had given him. So Abraham's taking a whole bunch of stuff back with him to Canaan land. And here's the good news: he didn't know that God is bigger than our mistakes. And that's what I want to leave you with. God is bigger than our mistakes. When we mess up, when we give Sarah away to Pharaoh, God's bigger than that. He's better than that.
He's better than
He's
that.
when we have Ishmael, God is better than that. He's not going to forsake us and say, "Well, you messed up. Sorry, you had Ishmael." So we've had people do that in our lives. That's why we think that. We've had people say, you messed up. So that's it. I'm taking this. God doesn't take back his side. Though we are faithless, yet he remains faithful. So that's the good news. We can't mess up God, something that he's intending to do. So when he gave up Sarah, God is bigger than our mistakes. He's bigger than our mistakes. Hallelujah. He's bigger than our mistakes. So we can stop beating ourselves. What if I missed it? But God didn't say, well, now I don't know what I'm going to do. God knows way in advance when we're going to go on the wrong road. And he just reprograms the GPS and says, now turn right, and eventually it gets through to us and he gets us back on the path we should be on. We can't mess him up. That's why the story is written. And again, Abraham's learning faith. Now, and this is just phase one of Abraham learning faith. There's a bunch of other stuff that Abraham goes through where he learns to be faithful Abraham, who gets to the point where he's willing even to kill his own son if that's what God needs, because he so knows that God is going to come through in his promises. But unfortunately, we have to go through certain experiences. God has to bless us when the famine comes for us to know that God will bless us when the famine comes, because we don't know it until it happens. There's certain things sometimes all of us individually have to go through so that we can learn that God is faithful, he will come through. And we all have different areas of our lives where God has to teach us this. So the lessons you might have to learn is not the lesson that I have to learn. The lesson that I have to learn is not the lesson God's teaching you. But he sometimes allows certain things to happen, and then he comes, swoops in and delivers us so that we can go, oh, so when I'm totally broke, he'll still come through. When I'm totally lost, he'll still give me direction. When I'm still, whatever our situation is, God is bigger than that. So that's the good news, and that's why Moses is recording the story, and we're delighted that Abraham messed up so that we can learn from his mistakes. So we can see what he went through and say, oh, now I can learn from Father Abraham, and we bless him, and God blesses us. So I will stop there and hopefully see some of you on Wednesday for the Wednesday night Bible study at 7 o'clock. We're in the book of Matthew, and it's getting crazy. And others of you, hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. And God bless you.